I'm Scarlett, a 28-year-old who just got married last year. I met my husband, Henry, at work, and after a 2-year office romance, we tied the knot. Upon marriage, I quit my job and rented an apartment near my in-laws' place, where we started our life together as a couple. Our relationship with my husband's parents was good initially. Although there were minor hiccups right after the wedding, both my father-in-law and mother-in-law were generally kind people, and they didn't engage in typical daughter-in-law bullying. Since we didn't live together and maintained a reasonable distance, I thought we'd get along fine. However, shortly after getting married, I found myself caught up in a major incident that put my life in danger. It turned out that my seemingly gentle mother-in-law had been hiding an entirely different side of herself. In reality, from the time our marriage was decided until we officially started our newlywed life, there were constant disagreements with my in-laws. The issue arose when we went to announce our marriage, and my mother-in-law insisted on us living together. Both my husband and I wanted to spend our newlywed period alone, so we gently declined her request. However, my mother-in-law had been looking forward to living with her son after his marriage, and she lamented that her future plans had been ruined. She even cried, saying that her joy in old age had been shattered. Thankfully, my husband managed to convince her, and we avoided living together. But I couldn't help feeling anxious about how things would go with my in-laws in the future. I imagined that my forceful mother-in-law would find fault with everything I did. Perhaps she'd pressure us to have children soon. In my mind, she transformed into the stereotypical mean mother-in-law. However, my mother-in-law wasn't as bad as I had feared. Although we didn't live together, we had an agreement to have meals together at my in-laws' house once a week. She never imposed household chores on me and efficiently hosted us. My husband, being the eldest son, didn't face any pressure about being the heir, and they never asked about grandchildren. But there was a significant issue: my mother-in-law's cooking. As a dedicated teacher, she hadn't had time for elaborate cooking during her working years. After retiring, she decided to explore dishes she hadn't been able to make before. She taught herself various recipes and became completely obsessed with cooking. The issue is that my mother-in-law insists on having us try her new dishes, no matter what. Even though she lives with my father-in-law, he prefers simple, healthy flavors and avoids my mother-in-law's herb and spice-laden creations. So, it's mainly my husband and me who end up sampling her experimental menus during our weekly meals together. She proudly serves dish after dish, but unfortunately, they're not all delicious. When she asks for feedback, my husband gives honest comments, but as the daughter-in-law, I can't bring myself to say they're terrible. When she proudly claims, "I put extra effort into making these for you," all I can respond with is, "It's delicious." When I try to step into the kitchen and help, my mother-in-law guards her territory, refusing any assistance. Week after week, I endure her cooking. But eventually, my husband, fed up with the awful dishes, bluntly asked her to tone down the experimentation. Perhaps offended by his words, my mother-in-law stopped introducing new dishes during our meals. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking I'd avoid any more strange culinary experiences, but she wasn't ready to give up just yet. When my husband is at work, my mother-in-law goes out of her way to bring food to our apartment and make me try it. She probably knows she'd be turned away if she came when my husband was home. Since I'm alone, there's no risk of refusal, so she deliberately times her visits during his work hours. With a triumphant expression, she enters our apartment, insisting that I taste her meticulously prepared dishes. No matter how much I protest, whether claiming I've already eaten or that I'm not hungry, she won't budge, insisting I take just one bite. I'm not sure if she genuinely tastes her own cooking or if her palate is just off, but her dishes remain consistently terrible. It seems she deviates from recipes, adding her own twists. Her seasoning measurements are haphazard, resulting in overly intense flavors or overpowering spices that leave me choking after a single bite. I wish she'd stick to the recipe, but perhaps she's overly confident in her culinary skills. While I've endured her surprise visits, my patience is wearing thin. I can't be cold and turn her away, especially considering our relationship with my in-laws. Yet, there's a limit to how much I can tolerate. The frequency of my mother-in-law's visits gradually increased. Initially, it was about once a week, but eventually, she started coming every other day. Feeling stressed and at my wit's end, I confided in my husband. He was surprised and wondered why I hadn't told him sooner. He sternly warned my mother-in-law and emphasized that I didn't have to endure her cooking. He instructed me to contact him if she showed up uninvited again. After that scolding, my mother-in-law stopped coming abruptly, and I regained peaceful days. According to my father-in-law, even at their home, she stopped experimenting with strange dishes. Perhaps she had indeed reflected on her behavior. I realized my husband was right. I should have consulted him earlier. However, my mother-in-law wasn't one to be discouraged so easily. Exactly at noon, the doorbell rang, and to my surprise, my mother-in-law stood there holding a pot. My spine felt like it was freezing. I immediately reached for my phone to seek help from my husband, but unfortunately, he was away on a business trip that day, and I couldn't reach him right away. My mother-in-law seemed well aware of my husband's work schedule. She must have deliberately chosen the day of his trip to visit. With a beaming smile, she said,
"I've made an authentic curry, and I'd love for you to try it, Scarlett."
Despite feeling desperate, I suddenly thought I'd be okay this time. After all, curry has strong flavors naturally, so even if my mother-in-law had added extra seasonings, it wouldn't bother me too much. I decided to endure and began eating the curry she served, hoping she'd leave soon. She watched my reaction with a smile. The first bite tasted slightly bitter yet sweet, with a medicinal undertone, but it was bearable. I washed it down with tea. When she asked if I wanted seconds, I declined politely, claiming I was full. Satisfied that I'd eaten at least one serving, my mother-in-law left in a good mood. Being caught off guard by weird curry was better than enduring hours of shouting after resisting. Little did I know that I'd deeply regret sympathizing with my mother-in-law later. That evening, while shopping at the supermarket, I suddenly felt breathless and collapsed right there. I couldn't stand up straight, swaying with dizziness, and my limbs went numb. People around me noticed and called a store employee. My memory ends there. When I regained consciousness, I was in a hospital bed, with my worried husband looking down at me. Apparently, I had been urgently transported to the hospital after losing consciousness at the supermarket. The store employee had called an ambulance, and luckily, an acquaintance who happened to be shopping at the same time contacted my husband. He rushed over from his business trip. I couldn't fathom why I had suddenly collapsed. I had no pre-existing conditions, and until the day before, I felt perfectly fine. However, the doctor's explanation shed light on everything.
Could it be nutmeg?
According to the doctor, consuming large amounts of nutmeg can cause symptoms like difficulty breathing, dizziness, and vomiting. It perfectly matched the condition I experienced. If I had ingested a large quantity of nutmeg, there's only one thing that fits: my mother-in-law's curry. The discomfort I felt while eating the curry was likely due to the excessive nutmeg. I felt intense anger toward my mother-in-law. Enough is enough. I asked my husband to bring her to the hospital. And I requested that my husband bring the curry my mother-in-law made for lunch and all the spices she used. After a while, My husband escorted my in-laws to the hospital room.
Scarlett, are you okay?
He approached me with a worried expression. In stark contrast, my mother-in-law stood there, looking sulky. My husband showed the doctor the pot of curry he had brought, just as I had instructed. The doctor, seemingly detecting the smell, shook their head in disbelief.
Why would you feed her something like this? If she had finished it, she might not have survived.
Both my husband and I froze at the doctor's words. My father-in-law turned pale. However, my mother-in-law vigorously shook her head and presented an empty nutmeg jar.
That's impossible. This is what I used in the dish.
At that moment, everyone except my mother-in-law was furious. My father-in-law trembled as he shouted.
What have you done?
My husband joined in.
Because of you, Scarlett was almost killed. Putting an entire jar of nutmeg in curry. How absurd!
He lunged at my mother-in-law, but she deftly evaded his grasp.
Oh, come on. It was just a little too much spice. No need to get so worked up.
She pursed her lips, showing no signs of remorse. The doctor then explained in detail about the toxicity of nutmeg.
Excessive nutmeg consumption has even led to fatalities in children. Nutmeg can cause symptoms like the ones you experienced: difficulty breathing, dizziness, and vomiting. Ingesting more than 0.17 ounces can be toxic.
The jar of nutmeg my mother-in-law used contained 0.53 ounces, far beyond the safe limit. If I had followed her suggestion and eaten more curry, it could have been disastrous. However, my mother-in-law stubbornly denied any wrongdoing.
But Scarlett is perfectly fine now. It's not my fault. Maybe her health was just poor that day.
She even had the audacity to complain.
After all the effort I put into cooking, I'm treated like a villain. And calling an ambulance just because of a little dizziness? Young people these days are too fragile. It's infuriating.
She glared at me, lying in bed with an IV, and berated me. Despite nearly causing my death with her cooking, she showed no concern for my well-being and refused to apologize. Everyone was dumbfounded by her lack of common sense. It seemed futile to say anything more. In the midst of our collective exasperation, my husband sighed and said,
Enough. It's too dangerous to be near you. We're moving far away.
My mother-in-law, wide-eyed, exclaimed,
Moving? Why?
My husband, frustrated, replied,
Why? It's obvious. Scarlett's life was at risk, and you haven't shown any remorse. We need to escape before something worse happens.
His words resonated with me. I wholeheartedly agreed. We needed to distance ourselves from my mother-in-law before it was too late. Then, my mother-in-law muttered, her shoulders trembling.
How could you, Henry? I thought we'd be living together soon.
I was dumbfounded by her words. It turned out my mother-in-law had intended to move in with us. Living together and being served poisonous meals every day, no number of lives would be enough to endure that. My patience snapped. I mustered my strength and sat up, shouting at her, Enough! How long will you avoid taking responsibility? You're the only culprit here. Coexisting is out of the question. I don't want to see your face anymore. Consider our ties severed. My forceful words surprised my mother-in-law.
Scarlett, please. Can't you forgive me?
She approached my bed, seemingly trying to appease me, but my father-in-law intervened, grabbing her arm. She was then dragged out of the room. Fortunately, I recovered smoothly and was discharged from the hospital 2 days after being admitted. While I was in the hospital, my husband diligently prepared for our move, and as soon as I was out, we relocated to an apartment near his workplace. Later, I learned from my father-in-law that my mother-in-law genuinely believed that adding copious amounts of nutmeg would improve the taste. Apparently, she thought all those questionable dishes she'd served were made with love. Knowing that my mother-in-law didn't harbor murderous intent initially brought some relief, but her one-sided affection had become a nuisance. Moreover, her lack of remorse, even after my hospitalization due to her cooking, disqualified her from ever stepping foot in the kitchen again. Ultimately, it seems I was merely her convenient taste tester for poison. Cutting ties with her was definitely the right decision. After settling into our new place, my father-in-law visited our apartment to apologize once more. He hadn't eaten much of my mother-in-law's cooking, so he was unaware of how terrible it tasted. He expressed his intention to prevent any further harm by ensuring my mother-in-law never cooked again. In reality, she hasn't set foot in the kitchen since that incident. Losing her only hobby has left her quite despondent, but it's a consequence of her own actions. I'm glad to hear that despite the early troubles in my marriage, there was a joyful event 6 months after moving to my new home. I became pregnant. Both my husband and I had been eager for a child, and when the pregnancy was confirmed, we celebrated together. My father-in-law is also looking forward to the grandchild's arrival. Moving forward, I hope to enjoy a peaceful life with my husband and our baby.
How was this story for you? And thank you for considering subscribing to our channel. Let's meet again in the next video.